Gabriel, and these are the overall interviews where I am wearing overalls and interviewing writers, authors, people involved in the literary community who are doing fascinating things. And today we're meeting with Pat Matthews, a memoirist who has just completed her first memoir with the Narrative Project. Pat, welcome.
Welcome. It's good to be here. I'm glad to see you again. What a wonderful thing that you're doing. And I love your overalls.
You know, I just decided at a particular age I'm going to be violently comfortable. And so here we go. So, Pat, you have just completed a memoir, and could you tell us a little bit of its title and just a little bit about it?
Well, it actually started out with a different title, but the one that I've settled on for the time being is Stardust on the Barroom Floor. And it's a memoir about my childhood and how that evolved into a 35-year career as a clairvoyant. And it takes a little bit of a different twist because I didn't grow up with intuition or clairvoyance as a day-to-day conversation at the dinner table or anywhere in the world that I grew up in. So when I landed into that profession, for me, two major questions popped right into my head. And one is, who is Pat Matthews? And the other one is, what in the world is this clairvoyance or intuition that I've just fallen into? And this book is kind of a bit of an answer to those two things.
Fantastic. Just for those of us who are not in the trenches, could you give us a quick definition of what clairvoyance means? Obviously, you've spent the book defining that, but just a quick definition so we can differentiate it from maybe some other ideas people might have in their head.
Okay, well, for the most part, clairvoyance is a word that I chose out of the dictionary because the word psychic, which is the best known word for this trait, to me just seemed awfully obnoxious and very trite and was sort of the catch-all for people that thought they were spiritual and different. And I didn't feel any of that because I didn't know what any of it was. Clairvoyance is basically a French term. It means clear vision. Been around for centuries, not a brand new word, not a brand new trait. My understanding now that I've been living with this since I was a child is that probably every one of us has some of this. You might call it gut instinct or just a feeling. But I believe we all have some aspect of that intuition that we refer to as clairvoyance.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, having been lucky enough to read a few excerpts from your writing, one of the things I appreciated was how what people generally associate with this sort of, I don't have the words actually, sort of not extraterrestrial, that's not the word at all, but unusual ability that has sort of glitter and sparkles around it is the way that you discuss this absolutely down to earth in so many ways. It's this combination of something we think of as so amazing, and you just describe this as this is down to earth. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit in relationship to your title.
Well, let me give you kind of a little bit of my background first, and that'll show you why I talk in dirt language. I get it right down to the level. I was literally raised on the floor of bars. The title Stardust on the Barroom Floor is because while as a child I'm running around, first of all, I'm living in a milk box when I'm a tiny baby. And then as I learn to crawl and walk and toddle around, I'm on that floor underneath all of those arms and legs of people drinking and swearing and laughing and dancing and having fun. And my childhood is the genesis of this instinct. I was raised in the perfect setting for somebody like me because when people go to a bar, their outward pretensions kind of fall away. And the reality of who they are tends to come out, and that's the stardust. I was able to just see people for who they were. I mean, they'd walk in the door sober. By the time they walked out drunk, the real person somewhere had shown itself in the middle of those things. And as just a curious child who just sucked up like a Hoover vacuum cleaner, I sucked up everything that was going on around me. I was able to watch that transmutation of people and their behavior and even the way they believed from the beginning to the end of their entrance into my home as the bar. So it's for me, it all began. It just looks like common sense because it was learned at the feet of a bunch of crazy drunks. My
It's
parents.
such an unusual story. And I think another thing that I really appreciated about your story is this is the kind of story that it could have just as easily been turned into something like, say, The Glass Castle, a story of overcoming these insurmountable odds. And what you've pulled forward are the gifts of this early childhood experience.
Yeah.
One
And
of the things I know that you talk, oh, please go ahead.
I was going to say, it's not that I didn't have any trauma, but we don't learn as much from the good things that happen as we do from the bad. And so when I look at any book, I don't care whether it's The Glass Castle or Educated or anything else, what comes across in that is what's been learned. Because without that suffering or without the traumas or dramas of life, we would just be plain vanilla. You know,
Absolutely. It is the challenges. I know in my own life, I gravitate more towards people who I know have been through challenges because there's just I have a sense of kinship with them, of that we can understand one another and get past the nonsense in a way, which I really appreciate in your memoir as well. I do have a question about the writing of a memoir because it's a big process. So how do you decide? I mean, how did you as a writer decide what to leave in and what to take out over the course of, because the book covers a couple of decades of your life, is that correct?
yeah, I guess the hardest part for me was I had started to write this book back in the 70s. I have boxes, literally boxes of writing. My daughter has attempted to throw many of them away, and she's been successful with a few, with me grasping things back occasionally. But I always kind of had an idea that I wanted to write something, but I never knew where it was going to go. And then when I first moved to Washington, I ended up with a broken hip and was bedridden for months. And then no sooner did that get healed and I had a hip replacement, which threw me back in bed again for a considerable amount of time. And all of a sudden, the need to write the book just happened. I didn't have to think about it anymore. I just had notepads and pens and my butt was glued to the bed and it just started to fall out. The most intriguing part for me was periodically going back to the box looking for specific dates and discovering that I had written almost verbatim the same thing while I was sitting in my bed here in Washington that I had written 20 or maybe even 30 years ago. It was very odd.
Isn't that I find that so frustrating to me in my own work, where I will just think, oh, I got it. And I start, writing furiously on something I think is the most genius idea I've ever had. And then I find that same idea in an old journal that I'd had 3 or 4 years ago, but I thought it was fresh to me right then.
It was a little bit of a shocker for me to discover that I had nothing new going on under the sun up here. It was same old, same old.
Well, okay. This may get in the way of the question I was going to ask next, but I was going to ask, has the writing of the memoir over the course of the time that you spent writing it in this recent period, has that changed your interpretation of events as they occurred in the past at all?
Oh, that's a big question. I guess I'm going to say yes and no. I don't think there's a way to be real clear about that because if I take the event of at the very beginning of my book, the very first scene is my mother's arm bashing through the front door window. And I then have my first kind of intuitive flash as a child. I see kind of in Doppler effect what's going on and how that's going to affect me. At the time that occurred as a child, I think I just took it as just like you would a breath of air. oddly enough, just because the way my brain works, when I went to write that down, all of a sudden it was real in a way that it probably wasn't as a child. I didn't have the ability then to have the emotional depth or the maturity of understanding about human behavior and cause and effect. So writing it down made things much more immediate in an emotive way that I had not, a lot of times when we're looking back at the past, it's like a picture on the wall. It's there, it may be pretty, it may be ugly, but it's on the wall. It's no longer in us. Writing it down brings it inside. And if we have that ability and that willingness to be open to all the emotions of whatever that inner picture is, it takes us to a place that maybe we were, but skipped some parts of it. Does that make sense a little bit?
It does. It does. I'm almost thinking about what goes on in a way, PTSD therapy in a way, because I've always thought, things that happen, things especially that happen to children, there's no way to know how to categorize the information, and so it just becomes part of the operating system. Whereas that same thing, if it happens to an adult, it becomes just a file, not the operating system. And I think, PTSD therapy, people learn to put things back in the files. And it seems like, in a way, as writing the memoir, you have to embody these experiences again, but as an adult with years of experience that allow you to name things and put handles on them and move them around a little bit.
It was interesting for me because most of my career I was a teacher. I taught a class that I had developed called personal awareness. And that class was all about teaching people how to be in tune with themselves and how their kind of internal cause and effect would kind of shape where they were going to go with their life. And for years, I taught that class. I talked about my family, my background, many of the things that had occurred to me, but I was able to do it somewhat dispassionately. And yet I was able to bring the students in those classes right to the core of their emotions at the time so that they could get a grip on why they made choices the way they did. It's fascinating to me to realize how I've gone through the vast majority of my life, being able to show other people how to get right into the immediacy of an emotion. And I was able to just stand back and go, not me. Doesn't matter for me. I'm
Isn't
smart.
it funny? Isn't it funny the tricks we play on ourselves with no idea that we're
Oh,
doing it?
business.
So my next question was going to be, what is the most surprising thing that you learned about yourself, both Pat Matthews, the person, and Pat Matthews, the clairvoyant, through the process of writing? And if that's the same answer or two answers.
Pat Matthews, the person, is clearly not Pat Matthews, the clairvoyant. They are, in many, many ways, almost like there's two complete separate people here. The clairvoyant became an instant public figure. She had a presence. She was young at the time she became known. She was actually very pretty and slender and sexy and all of those things that people desire when they're young, and all of a sudden you're like a movie star, so you can dress up and look this magical part. And I fit all of that, and yet there was always that girl next door attitude about me because I didn't have a lot of pretensions. I hadn't been raised to be magical. I'd just been raised. So there was the persona of this almost instantaneously famous person that became the clairvoyant. She could pretty much perform magic. She wasn't perfect by any means. When she was wrong, she admitted it. When she wasn't wrong, she just went, oh, good, that's nice. And on she went to the next thing. Pat Matthews, the real person, probably still struggles with self-identity. Probably still doubts who she used to be as a clairvoyant, which sounds really corny. But I look back at that as if that's not me. Does that make sense?
Well, it does to me. I've always had a sort of a spiral theory of what it means to be a human, where, for me personally, I mean, I come around in a cycle where I'm looking at the same scene that I was looking at 2 years ago, but it's from a slightly higher, I hope, perspective, but the view's different. And I think, oh, well, I knew nothing then, haha. But sure, again, 2 years from now, that someone else is going to be looking at this person saying, well, she knew nothing then.
I think
So,
the other thing that has separated these two things are that my clients saw me in kind of a magical realm, and I separated that from my family. I didn't discuss my work. My kids knew I was on TV and radio all the time. They understood that. They watched me walk out the door and do lectures for educational groups and teach at the U and whatever. But it didn't come home with me. At home, I was the one that cooked the meals and bitched about the beds needing to be made and pick up your dirty laundry and, for God's sakes, flush the toilet. All of those mother things. And to this day, I'm not real convinced that my children ever realized how much fame their mother had. I don't think they've ever seen me as anything other than a pesky mother. And I'm not real sure either one of them will ever want to read my book, because it might dispel the myth of who they want to believe that I have always been. And somehow I think I've owned their description of me almost more than I've owned that public persona, which is odd. They will be with me for life. My clients, no.
mm-hmm. And I'm imagining through this and future writings, you'll own your own description of you as well. That's a third voice in the room there.
Oh,
So I'm very excited to read this in its final version, having seen bits here and there. The experience of the first time clairvoyance really hits just out of nowhere like a freight train as an adult is fascinating. I don't want to give too many things away, but it really is an intriguing read, and I think people are going to enjoy it. So what's next for this book? And then after that, what's next for you as a writer?
Well, I've already done a query to one publishing company. I've got 3 more sitting on my desk that need to go, but I'm doing the lawn mowing right now. I'm cutting out words and scenes. I don't know that editing happened or ever ends until the editor finally says stop, and that hasn't happened yet. So right now I am querying. Hopefully this book will find someone that just can't wait to publish it. I've already got 2 other books started, possibly a third. One would be a biography of a family member. He was quite the Montana pioneer. Another one is kind of fashioned after my angry old grandmother, and I've already titled it Agnes, because it has to be. And then I have another one that's sort of a soft romancy kind of thing. I don't know that I have it in me to do another memoir. I'm not sure anybody cares.
And the beautiful thing about the amazing thing about memoir is that the more specific it is to a person's really unique experience, in some magical way, it becomes universal. That the reader, in finding their own experience through the writer's very specific experience, creates that connectivity between people and the shared learning experience of us all. I think that's the magical part of the medium. That being said, having heard your voice and your written voice and the way that you write and tell stories, I'd be very excited to read some, especially history in Montana, as well as fiction, because everyone who was in our writing group together was commenting on the Pat Matthews voice, which is a real treat to read.
Yeah, it's clearly unique. There's no 2 ways about it. I have tried to clean up the swear words a little bit in my adult life. And, that was my second language, or my first language, probably. English, it would be my second language. No, it's been interesting kind of having the body of this work done and setting it kind of off to the side. And even though I'm still playing with the editing part of it, it's been rather interesting to realize that I actually had a third language that I'd never really even thought about, and that was the language of emotions. Uh,
Mm,
and that's what the book is really about, that stardust. Um, I speak pretty fluent English. I speak really good swear language. We used to call it French when I was a kid. And my assumption is that if I ever let myself just go back into that intuitive realm, probably the best language that I speak is intuition,
mm,
or kind of
mhm.
the energy or the emotions of those around me. It's I think the fascinating thing for me, having been through it and walked away from it, and then now writing about it again, I don't know that you can ever lose that. You get to choose whether you want to pay attention to it or not. But at this stage of the game, there's a part of me that's kind of going, well, fuck it. I'm going to just go ahead and deal with that language because it's me. And
Absolutely.
and when I
Yeah,
walked away from it in 2014, 2015, I never thought I wanted to see that language in front of me again. And oddly enough, I find sometimes when I go to the grocery store, I kind of sneak an emotional peek at the clerk or somebody standing in front of me. I even do it with my own kids, although they'd hate to hear me say that, because what we don't realize is that we all put on a facade. And underneath that facade, there's a whole different truth. And that's the part I'd like to kind of sneak into now and figure out.
and that's the part where connection lives between people. It's when that stuff drops away that true connection happens.
The hard part for me
Um,
is nobody's giving me permission anymore. I kind of sneak in there on my own. I'm
I
not
used to
sure I
pay you
ever want
for
to
it.
go
Now you
back
gotta
out.
sneak it in.
Yeah, I don't know that I want to open the door up again and start doing readings, but it's sort of fascinating to figure out what's really going on underneath of a facade. And I don't think I ever thought I would see myself curious about that again. So I'm kind of enjoying that little piece.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we do. We take on. This has been a huge part of your life for such a long time, and it's nice to not have it and get some distant perspective, but then to be like, well, what was that about, and what can I take from it, and what can I leave behind? So,
I think where it
um,
shows, oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was going to
No,
say
you.
where it shows up the most for me is when I'm walking the dog, because when you're
Mhm.
walking a dog, somebody else with a dog is going to come up and start chatting. And all of a sudden, it's like I allow my intuition to figure out why that person is willing to talk to me, but not somebody else. Or are they
Mhm.
sad? Are they walking their dog because they're angry at a spouse or they're just tired of being alone? All of that now gets to kind of play.
Mhm. And nice to have it in the realm of play as
Mhm.
well. So, let's see, having completed your memoir, I guess, what advice would you have for any writers who are just thinking about this process? Do you have any advice for those folks
You
now that you're on
know,
the other side of it?
um, never, ever, ever doubt yourself is number one. And probably number two is make a habit of your writing time. I now get up at least 5 days of the week and sometimes six. I give myself Sundays off. I don't do anything on Sundays anymore. But I start at 8:30 and I quit at 11:30 or noon. And even if I don't have anything I think I want to write, I make myself write. And I just, if you can get into the habit of what it is you want to do, whether that's writing or painting a picture or being a gardener, whatever it is, if you don't create the space to turn it into a habit that you enjoy, it will not form itself.
Yes, I would totally agree with that. For me, I find that the time that I spend writing is almost just acting as a secretary. The actual work, I think, is done through all the other hours of the day. When I'm doing the dishes, my subconscious is going, grinding away. And as long as I come back to the project at the same time every day, it's there for me. But when I abandon it for a while, usually I abandon it because I have too lofty a goal for my daily writing. as long as I'm like, I'm just going to do a little bit and then I'm going to quit, it's great. But if I'm like, I'm going to write 3 chapters today, then I find I won't write for several weeks
Yeah.
because it's too much.
I don't put a limit, whether small or large, on what I'm going to do on any given day. I just know that this computer owns me during certain hours. And I
Mhm.
walk around my house, I guess. This is classic for me. This is a notepad with a rubber band around it. And I will be sitting in the other room reading a book or staring out the window or petting the dog, and all of a sudden brilliance occurs. And I write it down, and then I just leave it sitting off to the side, because once it's out, I don't have to worry about it anymore. If it has pertinence, oddly enough, it's on the page. If I need it for something, my mind will remember, and it will
Mhm.
pluck it off that page and put it on the computer. And if it doesn't get pulled up and onto the computer, not my business anymore. It's still on the page. It may come
Right.
back to serve me 10 years from now. I don't know. I have no idea where it's going.
Well, I think that seems like a pretty good way of getting off. Sometimes I think of the creative mind is a little bit like a spit valve on a tuba in my mind. And sometimes you just have to get that stuff out or you're not going to be able to play.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I think what really gave me the right to just write it down and let it go is going through some of those boxes.
Mm.
I found one. Do you remember the old printing paper that had the little holes on the side and it had a feeder? I have
Sure. Yeah.
stacks of that stuff. And oddly enough, at some point in my brilliant past, I went through my day timers and I put events from, I think, starting in 1970 all the way up until about 2012. I marked all of the important events on a sheet of this rotational paper. So if I need to go back and check a date now, I did it years ago. I'm like, huh? Who does that shit?
That's amazing.
So if
Someone who knew you were going to write a memoir in the future.
it's the darndest thing. I mean, if I start writing about Marilyn Monroe, all I have to do is go back in my mind and remember JFK dying, and I can go back a little bit and I can find all kinds of things about Marilyn Monroe and JFK, because my grandmother adored both of them. And
That's
all I have to
amazing.
do is just find a date, and then I can just backtrack from this. So weird. Who knew? I mean, talk about obsessive. The synesthetic mind does that, though. I think that what allowed me to quit being an intuitive was as soon as I realized that I'm basically just a synesthete, which means that I think the wires in my brain are cross-wired. So if I were to touch a hot pad with my fingers, my brain, instead of going to the word hot up here, might actually go to the word stupid, or it might actually go to the word
Mm.
red, or it might actually go to, what's that? It doesn't necessarily compute that what I'm experiencing is the same as other people, because my brain is cross-wired in a rather unique way. I would be considered a polysynesthete because colors, emotions, shapes, and smells are all 4 of my strongest sensations. So I smell people almost better than I emotively feel them. Sounds weird.
Wow. Wow.
As a child on the floor in a bar, smells mattered. You don't really think about it, but a cowboy boot for somebody raising sheep is going to smell different than a cowboy boot with somebody riding a horse or somebody moving cows. And somehow my brain just picked up stuff.
It is amazing what the mind can do when you look at something like synesthesia, which I know you have a very much a synesthetic mind. I once saw a show, I believe, where a synesthete learned to speak, I think it was Icelandic, which is one of the hardest languages, within 3 weeks,
Yeah.
because he was just able to make associations
Mhm.
using his synesthesia as a gift, which you've used it as as an intuitive gift,
I
to
have
understand people.
the biography that I'd like to write is about my great great grandfather. He obviously was a synesthete as well. He was multilingual in a time when people didn't really, he wasn't in Europe, had no access to major languages. And yet he was raised in a Métis family, and they speak all kinds of Creole, French versions of English. So he had Métis, pure French, English, German, Cantonese, and then about a half a dozen different Native American languages. And he could just suck them up like a sponge. And that's common in synesthetes. I wouldn't say it's common in all synesthetes, but certain types of synesthetes have that ability to connect different words with different places in the brain so that they make good sense. I just did it in my attempt to figure out what people around me were doing when I was a child. It was my safety net and my
Right.
curiosity.
Your security depended on it sometimes. Yes. Well, I'm very excited to read your memoir when it comes out. Currently called Stardust on the Barroom Floor. Um, where can we keep up with Pat Matthews? Do you have a website or?
I have a website. It's patmatthewswriter.com. And hopefully you'll be able to see this little blog piece on there. And with luck, I will begin to, a lot of the pieces I'm going to pull out of the book or change, or little essays that I've written along the way, some of my poetry. I'm hoping to get started doing that on my page. So hopefully people will be able to see it there.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I know we were talking before we began recording about some of the wonderful stories that you aren't going to be able to keep in the memoir. So those will be fantastic to read on the blog to get a taste of things to come.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for taking time to talk with me, Pat. I'm going to be sure that how to connect with Pat is in the notes underneath, and be looking for that book. Nice to talk to you, Pat.
Thank you.